This is the recording from one of Sprout Lab's webinars on how to use digital learning to accelerate the 70-20-10 model. We don't actually record the live sessions of our webinars. We keep them and try to build them into an interactive experience. And we find that even if people were just using the whiteboard, that people will participate less if it had been recorded. What I have started to do with these is leave some of the whiteboards in the presentations and talk a little bit about what people actually wrote on those as well, because there's been some really great contributions from people in those sessions. What I'm going to be talking about today is really around 4 different areas: performance support, using digital learning to enable transfer of learning, and how digital learning can be used to allow people to practice new skills, and also to cap off and finish with some success factors about social learning. So first of all, what's meant by this idea of accelerating learning? And probably really in terms of workplace learning, it's about accelerating learning while working. It's not just about sort of increasing the number of courses people do, but it's also increasing the amount of continuous learning that's happening in an organisation. 70-20-10 as a learning model and concept has actually been, and is quite often talked about in the same sentence as continuous learning. So it's essentially increasing the amount of learning people are doing while they're working, not taking a pause out from time so much to do different styles of things. I think it's interesting to pause for a moment and have a look at this 3 functions of L&D from a Finnish but academic. So essentially what she's done is sort them in, and sort the functions of L&D into new knowledge, sharing knowledge, and creating new knowledge. So new knowledge is things like the traditional activities of L&D. Let's bring in some new skills on project management. Sharing knowledge is how do we onboard people to the organisation's practice, and then creating new knowledge is the thing that's really different for L&D. It's about sort of creating new and innovative ways of working. So in terms of acceleration, what this means is actually bringing new practices and new ways of working and increasing change, and making sure knowledge and practices aren't lost, increasing the amount of sharing that happens, and especially sharing of good practice, and then also increasing the capability and capacity of organisations to be able to innovate quickly and work in a more agile way. For me, the 70-20-10 learning model is really at its core an experiential learning model. Now, this is, and I do mispronounce his name, Cobb's experimental learning series. So it's been around for a little while. And I think it's really interesting to think about these in terms of 70-20-10. Quite often, and I suppose when I started with experiential learning and project-based learning, I went straight for this concrete learning experience. And it took me a little while as a trainer to realise that in actual fact, you needed all parts of this cycle for things to work. And I think that's one of the things we quite often see in 70-20-10. People struggle with actually what sort of experiences people can have as learning experiences, but they also forget that sometimes it's actually the observation and reflection, and then also building the concepts before they go back into testing those and putting those into real experiences. I think also the other thing, especially in terms of digital learning, that people quite often don't have a good chance to be able to practice new skills before they actually have to apply them, and digital learning has some really powerful ways of being able to do that, to be able to practice things. So, I mean, in some ways what we're talking about here, I think, is really 3 things. Increasing the amount of reflection that people are doing, reflecting on what they're doing, observing what they're doing, increasing the amount of time that they're collaborating and doing that with others, and then increasing the amount of what I've heard called first-hand experiences. So rather than a trainer or a e-learning module or a resource talking about an experience or talking about an idea or process or procedure, the actual learner experiences it to be able to build a set of knowledge about it through reflection and collaboration with others. So during the webinar, we then moved on to an interactive activity that was about barriers and enablers. One of the interesting things around this particular one was that some of the barriers and enablers were very similar. So some of the barriers were lack of time, and the enablers were actually making sure there was structured time, making sure there was time out and there was time for reflection. Some of the other barriers that were interesting were the lack of time and knowledge on what reflection is and how it works, a focus on KPIs and the fact that reflective thinking in workplaces is actually hard to measure the KPI and return on, and then the desire for people to perform quickly. Some enablers, which were sort of some nice ones, were things like putting time in your calendar to reflect, supportive managers, and good coaching support as well, and recognizing the value of reflection and making sure it's linked to other training materials as well. Cool. The other side of the title for this particular webinar was the notion of digital learning. I just actually want to drill into this, into the meaning of digital learning and digital thinking for a moment before we go any further as well. Now, we use the term at Sprout Labs digital learning, not e-learning, for a few reasons. E-learning has become associated with incredibly bad learning experiences, a bit of information with a quiz at the end, maybe one or two small interactions that are still really focused on testing people's knowledge. For me, digital learning as a term is a whole lot more expansive. It includes social learning and collaborative learning. It includes more than just e-learning, and it takes in things like virtual classrooms as well. I also think the word digital learning creates a better alignment for learning activities with the rest of organisations thinking around digital learning, and sometimes some organisations do just use that term digital. Quite often what they're talking about is digital marketing and digital ways of transforming how organisations do business. So by working and sitting there doing using that digital word, this creates a different sort of alignment with those sort of transformations that are happening in other parts of the business. The thing about this word as well that is interesting that I hinted at before, digital technologies change over time. There's actually a deeper layer of things happening around the use of technologies in workplaces, and that's to do with digital thinking. And as I sort of drilled into and sat there and was doing the research for this webinar, I sort of thought, look, I'd like to talk a little bit about digital thinking, and didn't come up with a framework I felt completely happy with. So these particular 4 things of automation, flexibility, interaction, and collaboration are things that are a combination of different people thinking. So automation, I mean things like e-commerce, and I think this is where we've done really well in learning and development to automate a whole lot of things like course enrollments, compliance, tracking, and then digital technologies add another layer of flexibility. Mobile ability to be able to access mobile information has given that sort of sense of flexibility. There's a whole sort of working from anywhere at any time. And once again, that's one of the real enablers that have happened in the past with digital learning. We've made it a whole lot more flexible, which has actually quite often meant that there's been a better uptake of learning in organisations as well. It's these 2 things down the bottom, especially the interactions, we're not so good at in learning. So I was trying to think through a term to be able to talk about digital thinking in terms of high-end interactions, simulations, games, that sort of immersive environments where you've got a rich set of possibilities about how you interact with things, which really means working in a sort of more rule-based way. Another good example of interactions and this type of digital thinking is the way Amazon makes referrals to you about what types of books you should be using, reading, and might be useful to you. The last one is that really digital technologies allow different types of collaboration, which is why we're seeing a sort of explosion of social media in our personal lives, because it just allows a different way of collaborating, connecting, and having relationships with people. So I really think it's around these four things, and on the blog and possibly in later webinars I'll keep on doing more work around these ideas as well. The interesting thing for me as well is many of the things that I'm talking about and seeing in digital learning is actually also features of the digital workplaces. A really good example of this is a piece of project management software called Podio that's made by Citrix, that essentially it's social networking applied to project management. So it could be both used in terms of digital learning, and by its nature it's a collaborative process, but really it's actually designed as a tool for enabling a digital workplace and automating project management workflows as well. Which is sort of interesting because quite often we've seen, and especially in strongly technical organizations, where introducing a new piece of technology, either for doing work rather than actually learning, or sometimes for learning, actually has meant that there's been a shift in learning cultures to sort of the complete opposite to what you sort of really think about it. In some ways you sort of think about sort of, oh, how are we going to use this first? But in technical environments, quite often it's the, oh, wow, we've got a new shiny tool. What can we do with this? And people are sometimes more flexible because they see different things in the tool, and they're very tool focused as well. And by technical cultures, I don't just mean IT-based cultures. I mean sort of areas which have complex skills and knowledge problems. So during this particular webinar, I'm going to be webinar recording, I'm going to keep on returning back to a scenario. People who've been to my webinars in the past or watched some of them, you'll know Rebecca. So she's an L&D manager that I've used a couple of times, and particularly she's got this problem in her organisation where she wants to improve her employees' risk management skills. So I'm going to keep on returning back to this scenario in the whiteboards and talk about how some of these digital learning technologies and approaches can be applied to Rebecca's problem. In our learning by working frameworks, we have 3 design patterns. One based on that, the 3 functions of L&D. Really this sort of notion of increasing knowledge about risk and increasing skills about risk in Rebecca's organisation is actually about bringing new knowledge into the organisation. So it's going to start in the 10, then I think of it as moving and being supported in the 20 by people's managers and peers, and then being really embedded by new activities. It's a classic, what's called a learning transfer situation. So, first of all, in that 10, at formal learning space, how can digital technologies be used to really sort of transform and change our formal learning experiences? Unfortunately, for most of what we do, we copy what we see around us. We have what I call monkey neurons, where we actually literally copy what we see. And for most of the internet, it's not, and most of our digital engagement is not actually about learning experiences, it's about content. It's about reading blogs, seeing newsletters, looking up information. It's not really a way and means of being able to have a learning experience. It's more about the gaining of information. What digital learning can do is simulate the real decision making and the environment that people make those decisions in. Now, this is a really simple sentence with a complex set of problems. It means a really different way of thinking about the instructional design, the visual design. It really means moving from a content-focused approach to a performance-focused approach that's based on decisions. You know how with the digital thinking, it's really about that interaction design and thinking about designing learning experiences based around a series of rules rather than designing learning experiences based around a series of bits of content. Another way of thinking about this as well is what formal learning can learn from the 70-20-10 model is that formal learning should be more experiential. It should be more like the 70. It should be more flexible and add a different type of learning experience to that. So, good example of this, which is actually a interesting one, because quite often you've even heard, and you're probably running through the back of your mind, that I'm talking about simulations. Actually, not always so much about the high-end simulations. What you can see here is actually a learning program for patent examiners. Patent examiners deal with written documents all day long. So essentially, that's what the learning experience is organised around, is written documents, the specifications, the references and citations that they deal with, the reports that they have to write in different formats. And essentially what they do is they actually work through this particular thing in a way where they click on these and have questions to explore the interpretation and their actions around those. So the documents are text-based, so in actual fact the learning experience in some ways needs to be in a similar thing that needs to be text-based as well. Sorry, I just jumped forward a little bit on that slide. So we did a really great session in the webinar on how Rebecca could increase her 10. Just grab my notes from that. So some of the things that sort of got talked about were, and repeatedly, about the use of case studies with questions and answers about those, and simulations, and the use of video in those as well, to be able to really give a strong sense of what it's really like. Branch questions with video, and also the use of role plays. And there's some really interesting things you can do very simply with role plays online as well. Doesn't always need to be complicated. Cool. On to the second topic, learning transfer, which I sort of hinted at. That is one of the things that Rebecca's problem is really about in terms of what she's dealing with. That I'm sure everyone and many people have seen the forgetting curve in terms of learning and development. And it is this whole thing that you might have something that's in the 10 and people have immediate recall of what they're learning. And then if they're not applying that, there is a rapid loss of those skills and knowledge. And the discipline of learning transfer has been developing over the last period of time, and a lot of what it's really about at its core is being in a spot where it's making people reconnect with the content in multiple different ways. So I'm just going to talk about 3 different examples of how that can be done. Here's an example where Sprout Labs has developed a resource on family violence. Essentially, people do the classic course, and then afterwards, after they've done the course, I think it's after 20 days, there's another email message that reminds them about the course, and then after another 60 days, there's another message that reminds them about the content in the course, and expands on some of the content as well, and reminding them what they need to be aware of in the workplace around family violence as well, and how to possibly help and support people. So it's sort of getting people beyond the sort of first course and giving them sort of a reconnection to the content. This was the first level of this. The next level of what we're starting to work with now works in a way where, rather than it being email messages, it's actually activities that happen over a period of time, so people are actually doing a more active learning experience. So a couple of other tools that I think are really useful for learning transfer. One is called CoachMe. It's a web app and mobile app. I actually personally use it. You set a goal, and then you set how many times you're going to check in with that on that goal per week, and then you can click in on that, and it also gives you prompts and reminders about what you're meant to be doing and nudging you forward to be able to work. The second layer of it is that for a fairly cost-effective price, you can actually be coached via text messages by an actual person at the other end in that area as well, and also have Skype conversations as well. CoachMe has bundles and packages for organisations, especially around soft skills and leadership skills. So essentially you can actually buy the coaching skills for a group of people who can then work together towards the goal, as well as then have personalised coaching at a fairly affordable price as well. I think it's a really powerful platform that's very simple and elegant. I think the real power for me is it goes beyond just a nudge and check-in. It does have this social and this coaching inside of it as well. The other tool that I'm quite fond of is a tool called 70/20 from some people called Fort Hill. Fort Hill have probably been the world leaders for a long time in learning transfer. They've built a tool that essentially a manager or a individual sets a challenge, then people upload media-based evidence or text towards that challenge and record their percentage complete towards that challenge. What's really nice about this is it actually gives some sort of visibility to people's informal learning, and by putting the sort of evidence there, it gives it some visibility to that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. So then back to Rebecca's problem about risk management in her organisation, and how could she actually use learning transfer approaches. So one of the ideas was making sure there was manager and peer support for the learners, and it's been repeatedly found that essentially people's line managers are the most important people for learning transfer, and giving feedback on that as well. Someone talked about structured forum activities, so that people were able to reconnect with them, and working in a way where people to develop a set of trusted environment, and a visible set of subject matter experts that people could actually go to as well. One nice sort of sweet idea, which is actually a nice combination of multiple things, is to actually create a workplace project so that people actually have to make a change in the workplace. So they're actually in a spot where they're moving beyond just possibly doing an upfront course and then actually having to implement something as well. And feedback, and getting feedback and 360 feedback around their skills in this particular area after the learning experience, so they need to re-engage with it. Now, one of the things that sort of seems to go together with the notion of 70-20-10 learning models is performance support. I've actually heard people almost get the two ideas quite confused. But it is a really powerful idea, the notion of performance support, because what it's really about is giving people the knowledge and information they need just in time, instead of it being just in case, is the core. So essentially thinking about, well, what knowledge, what information, what people do people need as they're doing the job in the 70 to be able to do it well, rather than putting people through a formal training course in the 10, which might then be lost through the forgetting curve and through the lack of integration, and it possibly builds a more experiential based way of working. The thing for me is that I sort of, and you just even heard me talk about it, that in some ways I think about, and a lot of people do this, dive straight for this notion of performance support being about applying when you need to do it. But this sort of 5 moments of needs notion is a really important one, I think, because essentially I think of it as when the new is the training experience can actually be organised around using the performance support and job aids. So when people see it for the first time, they use it in a different way. Performance support can sometimes be set up in a way where people, if they need more detail, they can drill into them as well. The performance supports they need for solving and for change are actually also sometimes different to the ones that are for applying as well. I think this sort of 5 moments of needs sorts of expands it back out further for me. Now, just to give you a quick example, and performance supports are not just about information. So this particular example is a project Sprout Labs built a little while ago for a training organisation that was doing lots of work around writing procedures and then training organisations in those procedures. They found that, like you might expect, people didn't always follow those, so that they were wanting to actually digitalise and automate some of their checklists. So we built a mobile tablet-based application, which it meant that the safety checklist got sort of monitored and checked off in real time, and it increased the level of engagement with people's actual following of the procedures, and got people thinking about things that they might not normally think about. Now, I think I went off on a bit of a tangent on this particular thing in the webinar because I had the wrong title on this particular one. But I think this sort of performance support thing is a really nice one with Rebecca's risk management problems. Because the thing about the risk management problems is they're probably going to be rich, complex, and never quite the same. So having a set of tools and examples could be really powerful for people to, when they go to apply things, to sit there and go, okay, so what are the steps I need to think about again? So having a portal of resources is probably the classic bit of performance support to this. Another couple of things that could be really nice is, and performance support, it doesn't just have to be about resources, it can also be about people, making sure you have champions or help desks and support people as well in organisations around these things. Cool. On to our last topic. And I think I forgot to say before, in actual fact, these particular 4 areas, we've actually done whole webinars, I'll say, on learning transfer. So I'm feeling a little bit like I'm touching on a lot of information very, very broadly during this particular recording. And it's sort of not particularly easy to touch on many things quickly. The reason I think of social learning as part of the 70-20-10 is the way we talk about the 20 in the middle is it's a bit that holds the other things together. So formal learning as well as the informal learning and the experiential learning in the 70 is really held together by people's learning with others, with their managers and with their peers. And I think that's one reason I quite like the idea that it's in the middle, the 20, because that's what it sort of brings everything together. It's the glue that makes things happen. During the webinar, we did this exercise where we got people to sort of rate where they were in terms of social learning experiences and whether or not they had a platform. No one put up social learning is embedded in what they do. We had lots of people in this middle space and down towards the bottom where they had a platform but they didn't use it very, very well, which was sort of what I expected, because I think in actual fact it's quite complicated to get to this top level where it's embedded in what you do. Now, a few success factors I think are really interesting for social learning, and I suppose my spiel and Sprout Lab's sort of position on social learning is a little bit different to a lot of other organisations. And this has been some of our learning experience through working with blended learning programs that involve a layer of social learning. A lot of people sit there and say, oh, we'll do a formal learning program that might be an online course or a face-to-face, and we'll add a discussion topic before or after. Generally doesn't work. I see, and I talk about it in terms of fidelity, the highest fidelity experience, whether or not that's face-to-face or virtual classrooms is another one that can be a higher fidelity, will always dominate in people's engagement. So if you actually want to use discussions, contemplate just using discussions and that be just the learning experience only. The problem with a lot of things in social learning is people just don't have time to be able to do them. They get sort of jammed in top of other people's actually activities. So giving them a time frame, opening a discussion topic on Monday morning and saying, actually, we're going to close this down and we're going to finish the conversation on Friday, gives people some structure. We've also found in some particular situations, running them over the weekend actually works as well because people will catch up. One particular team we were working with, whether we essentially wanted to spend some time rethinking and doing some design work around the social learning experience with a group of SMEs who are incredibly busy because of the main build and design work we were doing. We actually timetabled into their calendar an hour a day to do the discussion topics. And that worked really well because they knew that that was a time when they actually had and they were meant to be focusing on their social learning experiences. The other reality is most of us are in a spot where email is important and it is the thing that triggers activity. So making sure that your discussion topics are being sent out to participants, but also if your discussion topics are not being sent directly to people's email boxes, sometimes during the middle of a discussion topic, if the facilitator is prompting people about what's happening. Community building shouldn't be underestimated, and it should be part of your early activities. And one really nice idea I just saw recently was that you actually hunt out the people who you know are natural community builders, who are naturally outgoing, and you say to them, you ring them up and say, look, we've just released such and such, can you go in and post something? And because of that, they will actually possibly really respond well. Now the last one, and it's not the least one, it's actually interesting because in the takeaways from the sessions, and possibly because it's right at the end of the session, a lot of people talked about this. Not just about discussions, and I think that's one of the things we quite often think about with social learning. We always think about the notion that it's about people talking to each other. It's also about people collaborating and working together as well. So the original group of people that the notion of community of practice came from were a group of engineers who progressively had been moved into out of their specialist team, and they came back together to sort of rebuild their knowledge. But they very quickly moved from talking to building what they called, and what is quite often called in community of practice jargon, a book of knowledge, a wiki style or a database of this is what we know, this is our know-how, this is how we go about doing it. Another example was a community of practice coming together around change management to build a resource to support change management in an organisation. It's funny, once the resource was built, they had trouble keeping on the energy going around the community of practice and I think that's okay, because essentially communities of practice can have a lifetime as well. But yeah, think about in terms of social learning, what could people actually be interested in building as a way of sharing their knowledge. And things like wikis and Google Docs and some of those shared documents possibilities, and SharePoint as well to some extent, have some really, really interesting features to be able to do some things. So, social learning and some of the ways that it could be used for Rebecca's. One of the really nice ideas here was for subject matter experts to run Ask Me Anything question sessions. That could be virtual classrooms or face-to-face sessions in small groups or large groups. Sort of getting together with groups of people to review articles and case studies. I'm actually literally reading off some of the notes off the whiteboard here, by the way. Okay, so another nice one to combine some of those things together was a group developing of a group clearinghouse that's built over 1 week. So that to do that whole thing of building something, but actually time box it. Yep, group building a risk matrix together, and shared problem solving as well. Now, last but not least, and it's one of those things because it comes up in the questions constantly, I just want to really quickly touch on, which is that how to evaluate 70-20-10 learning models, because it's sort of different, because if all of a sudden you're running less courses or you're doing courses plus so much other things, how do you actually measure your return on investment? I think the first thing is you need to contemplate, are you measuring the input or are you measuring the output? If you're measuring the output, you possibly have business metrics you can actually use for those measurements. If you want to measure the input, you need to make the learning visible, which is one thing that's nice about the 70-20-20 tool. By people uploading evidence, they're essentially making their learning visible. Another really just simple idea is the idea of logging your learning, and possibly just sort of taking some moments out, 5 minutes a day or 10 minutes a week to sit there and for people to sit there and say, and physically write it down, this is what I learned this week. This could be personal, it could be shared, it could be also worked in multiple different ways. The bit of technology that holds lots of promise for measuring and gaining and recording learning beyond the 10 of the formal learning is the Experience API, which used to be called Tin Can, which really is a little bit more of a classic application programming interface, which means, and this gives us a layer of flexibility, that you can feed information in from multiple different sources to one particular spot in a very shared, very flexible way of being able to record those. I still in its early days in terms of adoption. I think actually because this sector over here, and especially a lot of the learning management systems in the corporate world, haven't actually adopted it particularly well. It's been adopted quite well in some of the sort of resource development and very easy to integrate into intranets, but it's that sort of sense of, well, how do you combine it all together? Is the best way to put it, and still keep some of that learning that you might have to track in a learning management system as well. Cool. That brings me to the end. Thank you for listening to this. If you want to send me an email message about any of these ideas, and you want to have a conversation about using digital learning in the 70-20-10 model, just give me a hi. Thank you very much.